God, we want to thank you for Martin Luther King Jr., for you have chosen him as a strong leader to help lead nations. Till victory is won.
There was a different country before Martin Luther King Jr. came upon the scene.
Dr. King, were he alive today, would be celebrating his 91st birthday. Living into your 90s is no longer a rarity. But he was slain at the age of 39. And I would tell you that at that tender age of 26 years old in 1955, he was thrust onto the national stage as he led the successful Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. From that beginning to his death in 1968, a span of 13 years, he worked tirelessly to better the lives of all of us.
Welcome to InSight. I'm your host, Wendy Brokaw. A generation of Americans has grown up with no firsthand knowledge of how hard was the fight for civil rights, nor how violent. But here in Salem, Dr. King's legacy is alive and well, empowered by those who embrace his message that racial injustice and inequality is a problem we solve together as a community. I'm joined today by Casey Kopcho, Communications Director of the NAACP Salem Keizer. Welcome, Casey. I'm glad you could be here.
Thank you for the invitation.
This local chapter of the NAACP in Salem has been around a long time and is just as active as ever.
It sure has, and this year marks our 6th ever MLK Day celebration and event. And we did that at the McKay High School, where we had a 2-hour program with about 100 folks who showed up and stayed for the duration and took part in a number of activities, as well as had free lunch that was catered thanks to Salem Keizer Public Schools, and free childcare for the duration of the event. And then after that, took part in an hour-long march down Lancaster, and we had about 100 folks walking up and down Lancaster, celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
And there was a lot of energy that I saw, a lot of young people, and there was just a vitality to it because they saw something. They saw something that is relevant to them. What is that?
Well, I think when you think of it in terms, especially of the NAACP and with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what it comes down to is the interrelated nature of all of us. And he said in his letter from the Birmingham jail that life is interrelated. What happens to one directly happens to all of us indirectly. And that's something that I think the children and the youth, more than ever, how they're engaged in social media, where they can see what happens in real time everywhere, and it indirectly affects them. And you see that in some of the social justice issues that they are championing. You see that in high schoolers that walk out for climate change and walk out for gun violence. Because what happens in Florida or what happens in Santa Fe or what happens in El Paso affects high schoolers here in Salem, Oregon, just as much as it does children in Dallas, Texas, or anywhere else. And so that's something that we're channeling with the local chapter of the NAACP, and it's something that I think really shined through on Monday.
You mentioned something about the NAACP spearheading some ideas. What were those to meet the challenges?
Sure, absolutely. Well, right now there are 6 game changers that are undergone by the NAACP. Primarily looking at economic inequality. These game changers, again, are really core to the group's efforts around shoring up inequality for the African American community. And so when we talk about climate change and climate justice, if you look at the national website for the NAACP, it goes into great detail about how climate justice disproportionately affects communities of color. Power stations, for example, are often located in communities where the demographic is predominantly communities of color. So when we talk about climate justice, that's kind of the conversation and the drive. The initiative is raising the level of awareness. And when we talk about economic injustice, it's about jobs, it's about education, which is another one of the core game changers for the NAACP, is raising the level of education to level the playing field.
What are the big pushes that seem to be motivating people here to be involved with the NAACP? What are they getting involved in that really excites them?
One of the biggest ones, both nationally and locally, is for voter rights. And so right now, the Voting Rights Act is something that is somewhat under attack. And the NAACP is really trying to get the word out, one, on participating in the census and educating people on how important it is to make sure that you're counted in the census. And then two, to make sure that you register to vote. And three, are actually an active voter once you register to vote. So we have initiatives both nationwide and locally to help drive that. Monday we had a voter registration table and a voter education session. And that's something that we will continue to do, especially in a year, an election year like we find ourselves now.
Obviously, the NAACP is a nonprofit that needs volunteers. Is there an opportunity for people to find about how they could volunteer?
Absolutely. If you go to our website, sknaacp1166.com, or you go to our Facebook page, which is sknaacp on Facebook, you'll find all sorts of opportunities, as well as the monthly meetings, which are the first Monday of every month.
When he wrote his letter, his famous letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963, one of those sentences, and you said it already, was, "An injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere." And that's so important for people to understand, isn't it?
It is. And again, I alluded to it a little bit earlier with respect to some of the events that we've seen around the country and how they can impact us here in Salem. The same goes especially for communities of color when it comes to movements like Black Lives Matter, which we had a number of folks represent that movement on Monday as well. And so when you see police and brutality in communities of color around the world, now fortunately we've been very blessed in the Salem Keizer area where that hasn't been something that's happened recently. However, Monday I talked to a man who marched right alongside with me, and he has lived in Keizer for decades. And he talked to me about how not too many decades ago he suffered at the hands of police brutality in Keizer. And so when he has those stories to pass along to the youth that are here now, what happened to him directly affects them indirectly, and that's exactly what Dr. King was talking about.
That it could happen again.
That it could happen to them, but it changes their mindset, it changes their trust level of their community leaders and their police. And the way that we can combat that is through education and community engagement.
And are you seeing that, especially with police and law enforcement and the people of color?
I am, yes. And I think we've had a wonderful relationship with Chief Jerry Moore, who just recently announced his retirement, unfortunately. We're sad to see him go. But we look forward to working with the next chief, working with Mayor Bennett, and all city staff here in the city of Salem. We need to work especially with our Spanish-speaking communities. In the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, largely the demographic that represents the communities of color in Salem is our Hispanic population, many of which are Spanish-speaking. I happen to be a Spanish speaker, so one of the things and initiatives that we're going to be doing from here on out is trying to engage that community to make sure that they understand that we're here for them.
Well, thank you so much for telling us what's going on with the local chapter of the NAACP, and we look forward to seeing you again with many more updates.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'd love to come back.
Thank you for joining us today on InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw.